The wind carried a story that Maple Ridge would never forget. A story of a little girl who only wanted to learn to read, a police officer who refused to turn away, and a loyal German shepherd who guarded every heartbeat between them. On nights when the rain whispered through the pines, their courage lit up the dark like a prayer. But tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments, because every place on earth has its own Maple Ridge, a corner where kindness still fights the cold. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, love, and redemption, and may your day be gentle, blessed, and filled with light. The autumn wind swept through Maple Ridge, a small mountain town tucked between golden hills and whispering pines. Leaves spun in slow spirals across the cracked pavement, painting the streets in fire orange and rust. A thin mist clung to the old cemetery at the edge of town, where a dark wooden coffin waited beneath the fading light of afternoon. The air smelled of wet soil and distant wood smoke. People spoke softly, their voices muffled by grief and the rustle of leaves. Lily Hart, only 8 years old, stood beside the grave in a coat 2 sizes too large. The sleeves swallowed her small hands. Her hair, dark brown and slightly tangled, clung to her damp cheeks. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, carried the deep, searching sadness of someone who had already lost too much too soon. She didn't cry. She only stared at the coffin, as if trying to memorize every line of it, to hold on to something that was slipping away. Around her wrist hung a threadbare bracelet made of red yarn, the last thing her father had given her before the accident. Across from her stood Sarah Hart, her stepmother, a woman in her late 30s with sharp features and a tall, lean frame. Her hair, the color of pale gold, was tied tightly at the back of her head, revealing a face that had once been beautiful but now seemed carved from cold marble. Her lips were painted perfectly, her dark coat spotless, even in the drizzle. Sarah had been born into a family that valued appearance over affection. Her father had been a banker, strict and proud, who taught her that emotion was weakness and love was a transaction. Years of pretending to be strong had hardened her into someone who couldn't tell the difference between discipline and cruelty. She looked at the coffin with eyes that neither mourned nor softened. To her, death was an inconvenience, and perhaps a financial opportunity. The flag draped over the coffin fluttered in the breeze, the insignia of the local volunteer rescue team. Beneath it lay Samuel Hart, Lily's father. He had been a mechanic, broad-shouldered and kind, known for fixing cars without charging when families were struggling. He had died on a rain-slicked road, steering his truck into a ditch to avoid hitting 2 pedestrians. The newspaper had called it an act of heroism. To Lily, it was simply the night her world stopped. At the far end of the crowd stood Officer Ethan Cole, a man of 38, his uniform dark against the silver sky. His short blonde hair was damp from the mist, and faint lines framed his gray-blue eyes. The kind of lines carved not by age, but by memories that refused to fade. Ethan had moved to Maple Ridge 3 years ago after losing his wife in an off-duty accident. Since then, he had buried his grief beneath routine and silence. The townspeople respected him for his fairness and calm, but few knew how much loneliness hid beneath that composure. At his side stood Valor, his 7-year-old German shepherd, large and steady, with golden tan fur and a black saddle across his back. Valor had served as Ethan's K-9 partner for years, saving his life once during a warehouse fire by dragging him through smoke and broken glass. The dog now bore a faint scar across his muzzle, a reminder of that day. Loyal and intuitive, Valor had a quiet presence, sensing the emotions people tried to hide. Ethan watched the little girl at the grave, feeling something stir, that subtle pull of empathy that sometimes pierced even the strongest armor. Lily's stillness reminded him of himself after his wife's death. The same lost focus, the same hollow calm. He noticed how Sarah barely touched the child, how her hand hovered in the air but never reached out. The priest's voice trembled through the cold air, reciting prayers for peace and eternal rest. When the words ended, silence spread like fog. People began to leave, their shoes crunching on damp gravel. Only 3 remained near the grave, Lily, Sarah, and Ethan, who lingered out of duty, or perhaps something more. Sarah exhaled sharply, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. "Come, Lily," she said, her tone dry, impatient. "It's time to go." The girl didn't move. She knelt, picked up a folded piece of paper, and gently dropped it into the grave. Ethan caught a glimpse of it, a childish drawing of a man with a wrench, smiling beneath a maple tree. Sarah frowned. "That's enough!" she snapped. She pulled Lily by the arm. The girl stumbled but didn't protest. Ethan's jaw tightened, his instincts stirring, but he said nothing. He had no right, yet. As Sarah led the girl away, Ethan approached the grave. He rested a hand on the coffin lid for a moment. "Rest easy, Sam," he murmured. "We'll watch over her." Valor stood beside him, ears tilted forward, as if understanding. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of motor oil and rain, the scent of the man who used to fix everyone's engines for free. That evening, the clouds thickened over Maple Ridge, painting the sky in shades of charcoal and silver. Ethan drove his patrol SUV down the narrow roads, Valor sitting upright in the passenger seat. Streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting halos on the wet asphalt. The town was small, one diner, one post office, and 2 bars. Beyond them stretched endless hills where deer often crossed at night. It was peaceful, but that peace sometimes felt like a trap, holding secrets no one dared to disturb. He passed the Hart residence, a modest 2-story house with white siding that had yellowed with age. Through the window, he saw Sarah seated at a table surrounded by papers, insurance forms, if his guess was right. Lily sat across from her, head bowed, her lips moving as if whispering to someone unseen. Ethan slowed the car. Valor let out a low rumble, not quite a growl but a sound of unease. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I feel it too." Inside the house, the air was heavy. Sarah's voice cut through it like glass. "Stop staring, Lily. Go to your room. You're making me nervous." "I wasn't staring," Lily said softly. "Don't talk back." The girl obeyed, slipping upstairs. Her room was small, walls painted pale pink, the color her father had chosen. On the dresser sat a music box that no longer worked, and a photo of her parents from better days. Lily climbed onto the bed, clutching her father's worn leather cap. It smelled faintly of oil and pine. She whispered, "Daddy, I'll learn to read all your notes one day. I promise." Downstairs, Sarah opened a file marked Life Insurance, Samuel Hart. Her pale hands trembled slightly as she read the numbers. $13,000. Enough to start a new life, far from this little town. She bit her lip, calculating, but the bank representative had warned her. Payouts might be delayed pending verification. That meant waiting, and waiting meant living with the ghost of a man she could never compete with. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, stern, hollow-eyed. "You left me with nothing but debts and that child," she whispered bitterly. At that same hour, Ethan parked by the lake where the town lights reflected like broken stars. He rolled down the window. Valor rested his head on Ethan's lap, eyes soft and watchful. "You ever get the feeling, boy," Ethan said quietly, "that some promises outlive the people who make them?" Valor's tail thumped once, slow and certain. The wind carried a faint chime from the church bells in the distance, 8 slow notes marking the end of another day. Ethan leaned back, eyes half closed. Tomorrow, he would return to routine patrol, paperwork, the endless rhythm of quiet nights. But somewhere in the back of his mind, an image lingered. A little girl dropping a drawing into her father's grave while the wind tugged at her hair. He told himself he was only concerned as a police officer. Yet when Valor lifted his head suddenly and stared toward the Hart house, Ethan's heart answered with a silent truth. Some calls for help are never made out loud. As the mist thickened and the town lights dimmed, Maple Ridge seemed to hold its breath. The leaves rustled softly against the iron gates of the cemetery, whispering like ghosts keeping a secret. And beneath that whisper, a story had begun. One born not of tragedy, but of a promise waiting to be kept. The next morning in Maple Ridge broke under a blanket of gray clouds, the kind that promised rain but never seemed to fall. The air smelled faintly of iron and pine sap. The town was quiet, its usual hum replaced by that heavy stillness that comes after a funeral. From the outside, the Hart residence looked like any other home along Willow Lane. Chipped white paint, a narrow porch with rusted nails, and an overgrown hedge where a forgotten mailbox leaned at an angle. But inside, it was as if warmth itself had been evicted. Lily Hart sat by the window of her small room, legs tucked beneath her, watching the wind chase a lone leaf across the yard. Her eyes, once soft with curiosity, had dulled into the same quiet that filled the house. Downstairs, she could hear the sound of Sarah's heels pacing across the wooden floor, a measured rhythm that made Lily's stomach tighten. Sarah Hart, now in a fitted gray dress and pearl earrings, stood before a mirror in the dining room, papers spread out over the table. She was the sort of woman who treated each reflection like a battle she had to win, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there, adjusting a collar already perfect. The dark circles beneath her eyes were barely hidden under makeup. She hadn't slept well since the funeral. In the corner sat a half-empty glass of white wine, her breakfast since dawn. She picked up the insurance document and traced the printed numbers with a trembling finger. $214,000. The ink was dry, but the future it promised was still uncertain. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional soft bark from the neighbor's yard. On the mantel rested a single photograph of Samuel Hart, Lily's father, standing beside a half-finished motorcycle, grease on his hands and pride in his smile. Sarah had tried to move it once, but Lily had begged her to leave it. Now she ignored it, as though looking at the picture burned her. At the kitchen doorway, Mrs. Wilkins, the elderly neighbor, appeared with a paper bag in hand. She was in her late 60s, short and slightly stooped, her gray hair tied back in a bun. She wore a knitted cardigan with missing buttons and smelled faintly of lavender soap. "Brought some muffins," she said kindly. "Figured the little one might like something sweet." Sarah turned, her polite smile thin as paper. "That's thoughtful, Mrs. Wilkins, but really, we're fine. I thought maybe—" "Please," Sarah interrupted, voice soft but sharp at the edges. "We have everything we need." She took the bag anyway and closed the door before the old woman could say another word. Upstairs, Lily had heard the exchange. She knew that tone, the one Sarah used when she wanted the world to go away. When her father was alive, the house had been filled with sound, tools clanking, radio music, laughter. Now, it was as though silence had moved in and taken over every room. By noon, Sarah was on the phone, her voice low and tight. "You told me the payout would be processed this week. I've signed everything," she said. A pause, then a forced laugh. Yes, I know the system takes time, but time is expensive. You understand." She ended the call abruptly, pressing her temple as if her own words had given her a headache. Lily tiptoed downstairs, holding a worn notebook against her chest. "Can I go to the library?" she asked softly. Sarah didn't look up. "What for?" "To read." "Read?" Sarah finally raised her head, her blue eyes narrowing. "Your father used to waste hours with those silly books. He could have been making real money instead of fixing cars for free. I won't have you grow up dreaming about things that don't feed you." "But he said reading helps people." "Enough!" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. "Go upstairs and take that hat with you. It stinks of oil." Lily hesitated, then obeyed. On the way up, she glanced at the photo of her father and whispered so softly even the house could barely hear it. "I'll still read, Daddy." That afternoon, the clouds thickened, swallowing what little sunlight remained. Down the street, Officer Ethan Cole parked his cruiser near the corner grocery store. He stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his boots the only sound. Valor, his German shepherd, followed close behind, tail low but alert. The dog's keen eyes scanned everything, the mail truck idling across the street, the old man sweeping his porch, the Hart house at the end of the lane. Ethan greeted the store owner, Mark Jensen, a plump man with kind eyes and a red apron stained with flour. "Morning, officer. Haven't seen you around here since the fair." "Quiet week," Ethan replied, buying coffee and dog treats. "How's business?" "Same as always. Folks keep to themselves lately. The Hart woman came by yesterday, bought a whole case of wine. Strange for a funeral week." Mark lowered his voice. "That little girl of hers, never see her smile no more." Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "I noticed." When he returned to the cruiser, Valor gave a low bark, one that Ethan had learned to trust. He looked toward the Hart house. Through the curtain, a small shadow moved. Lily, sitting alone at the window, her notebook open, pencil in hand. For a moment, Ethan could almost see his younger self, the boy who used to write letters to his father, who never came home from war. He started the engine, but didn't drive away immediately. "Keep watch, boy," he said softly. Valor pressed his nose to the window, tail flicking once. By evening, the first raindrops began to fall, tapping against the glass like soft knocks. Lily sat at her desk under the dim glow of a small lamp, tracing letters in her notebook. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven. "Dear Daddy," she wrote. "Today I wanted to go to the library, but Mom said no. I think maybe she hates words." She paused, then added, "But I will learn. I promise." Downstairs, Sarah poured another glass of wine and turned on the television for company. The flickering light painted her face in shifting shades of blue and gray. A news report about missing funds from a local bank flashed briefly on screen, mentioning an investigation led by Deputy Grace Monroe, a young woman in her late 20s, sharp-eyed, with brown hair tied in a loose bun and a badge that gleamed against her Navy uniform. Grace was known in the department for her diligence and quiet resolve. She had grown up poor in nearby Ashfield, and corruption disgusted her more than crime itself. She watched the same segment later that night in her office, unaware that the case she was tracking, the forged insurance documents, would soon lead her straight to Sarah Hart. The rain deepened, drumming against the roof. Sarah stared at her reflection in the television screen, the face of a woman both weary and defiant. "You wanted to save everyone, Sam," she whispered to the empty room. "But who's saving me now?" Upstairs, Lily had fallen asleep at her desk, cheek resting on the open page. Valor's distant bark echoed faintly from somewhere down the hill, a steady rhythm against the storm. In her dreams, Lily heard it as a promise. The next morning dawned pale and cold. A mist rolled through the valley, swallowing the rooftops. Ethan stood on his porch with a mug of coffee, while Valor sniffed the damp air. "We'll check on them today," he said quietly. He wasn't sure why he said it aloud, maybe because promises sometimes need witnesses. Inside the Hart house, Sarah was already dressed, her hair pinned and makeup flawless. She pulled on her gloves, grabbed her purse, and called up the stairs. "Lily, I'll be back late. Don't touch anything while I'm gone." Lily stood at the top of the stairs, her notebook hidden behind her back. "Yes, ma'am?" The door shut, leaving behind that same echoing stillness. Lily waited until the sound of Sarah's car faded, then hurried to the window. Down the street, she spotted a familiar figure, the officer with the kind eyes, walking his dog. She smiled faintly and whispered through the glass, "Hi, Valor." The dog stopped, ears pricking up, as if he heard. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The storm passed through Maple Ridge during the night, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the gray morning sky. The air smelled of wet bark and engine oil, a scent that always clung to this town of lumber yards and old workshops. Ethan Cole drove his cruiser slowly down Willow Lane, the tires crunching over gravel, his eyes scanning the familiar houses where everyone knew everyone, or at least pretended to. Valor sat in the passenger seat, his golden tan fur still damp from their early patrol. His ears twitched at every sound, the creak of a distant porch swing, the bark of a stray mutt behind a fence. To anyone else, it was just a quiet morning. But to Valor, silence was never just silence. It was waiting. At the end of the lane stood the Hart house, half hidden behind an iron gate streaked with rust and ivy. Ethan had passed by many times, yet this morning, something made him stop. The gate was open, and the faintest sound, a soft, uneven sob, floated through the air. He parked, stepped out, and motioned for Valor to stay close. The wind carried the smell of burnt toast and damp leaves. Beyond the gate, on the gravel path, Lily Hart sat crouched on the ground. Her small hands were clutching torn pages that fluttered in the wind like broken wings. Her hair, tangled and wet from the drizzle, fell into her face. She was whispering something, perhaps to herself, perhaps to someone she missed. Ethan took a step forward, boots crunching lightly. "Hey there," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "You all right, kiddo?" Lily looked up, startled but not afraid. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears. "She tore it," she whispered. "My notebook. She said I don't need it." Her voice carried the fragile rhythm of someone used to speaking quietly. Before Ethan could answer, the front door opened sharply. Sarah Hart stepped out, her high heels clicking against the porch. She wore a dark blue dress and a wool coat, her hair pinned neatly, her expression carved from irritation. "Officer Cole," she greeted with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't expect to see you loitering around my property. Just making sure everything's okay," Ethan replied calmly. She seemed upset. Sarah's tone turned syrupy, that practiced kindness meant to dismiss. "Children get emotional, especially after what's happened. I'm handling it." Valor, standing beside Ethan, let out a low rumble, not a growl, but a sound of warning. Sarah's smile faltered. She stepped back slightly, her posture stiffening. "She's fine," she repeated, voice clipped. "A little discipline never hurt a child." Ethan's gaze lingered on Lily. The girl was trying to gather the torn papers again, her small fingers trembling. Without thinking, Ethan bent down and helped her pick them up. The pages were smeared with dirt, but he could make out uneven handwriting, lines of clumsy letters, forming words like dad, promise, read. "Pretty important stuff," he said gently. Lily nodded without looking up. It was my lesson. He wanted to ask more, but Sarah's voice cut through the quiet. "Officer, I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter." She reached for Lily's arm, her grip too firm. "Go inside." Ethan hesitated, instinct warring with authority. "If you ever need anything, Lily," he said, standing, "I'm usually around. You can leave the porch light on if it's an emergency. 3 times. Got it?" Lily blinked, uncertain, but something in his steady tone made her nod. Valor's eyes followed her as she disappeared inside. The door closed, and the house swallowed her whole. Ethan stood there for a long moment. Sarah turned to him with a faint, polite threat in her smile. "You have your job, Officer Cole. I have mine, raising my stepdaughter properly. We wouldn't want to confuse the two, would we?" "No," he said evenly, meeting her gaze. "But you'd be surprised how often they overlap." As he turned back toward the cruiser, Valor glanced over his shoulder once more at the iron gate, its hinges moaning softly in the wind. Ethan knew the feeling that crawled through his chest wasn't going away soon. That evening, Ethan filled out a brief report about a domestic welfare concern, though he knew it would go nowhere without evidence. Still, he had to write something. Valor lay by his feet, his tail tapping slowly on the floor. "She's not safe there," Ethan murmured. The dog raised his head, ears perked as if agreeing. Across town, in the small police substation near Main Street, Deputy Grace Monroe sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of financial records. The harsh light from the desk lamp drew sharp lines across her face. She was in her late 20s, her expression calm, but her eyes relentless. She had been tracking a suspicious string of transactions tied to a local insurance agent, a man named Derek Miles, middle-aged, thin, with slicked hair and the fake charm of someone who had spent too long lying for a living. Grace had already caught him once falsifying documents for property claims. Now, the pattern pointed toward a life insurance policy belonging to Samuel Hart. Grace rubbed her temples and reached for her coffee, cold again. "Damn paperwork," she muttered. Still, she made a note. Hart policy, beneficiary, Sarah Hart. Check Florida account linkage. Just then, her partner, Deputy Tom Avery, appeared at her door. He was tall, heavy-set, with a round face that always carried an easy grin, though his eyes were sharper than people expected. "You still here, Grace? Sun's been down an hour." "I'm close," she said, flipping through files. "I think one of these claims ties to that forged bank officer signature from last year. And guess whose name keeps showing up?" Tom leaned against the doorframe. "Sarah Hart, the widow from Willow Lane." Grace looked up, surprised. "You know her?" "Only by reputation. Used to be a real estate broker before she moved here. Word is, she ran into debt after her first husband passed. She's smart, but not the good kind." Grace nodded slowly. "Then this might be the break we need." Meanwhile, back on Willow Lane, the wind picked up again. The street lamps flickered in and out, their light stretching across puddles that mirrored the black sky. Inside the Hart house, Sarah poured herself another glass of wine. Lily sat on the floor near the window, her torn pages spread out like a puzzle. She was trying to tape them back together with a strip of masking tape she found in the kitchen. When Sarah noticed, she sighed in irritation. Still clinging to that nonsense? Lily didn't answer. You should be thankful, you know, Sarah continued, her voice rising as the wine worked its way through her system. Do you think anyone else would feed you after what your father left behind? Do you? I didn't ask to be fed, Lily whispered, but it was too soft for Sarah to hear, or too soft for her to care. The lights flickered once more, then steadied. In that brief darkness, Lily thought she saw movement outside, a shape near the gate, watching. When she peered closer, she caught a glimpse of fur catching the lamplight. Valor. The German shepherd sat silently by the fence, his head tilted, as if keeping guard. For the first time that night, Lily felt safe enough to smile. Inside the patrol car parked a few yards away, Ethan watched from the shadows. 3 lights, he whispered to himself. I hope she remembers. He reached down to scratch Valor's neck. Good boy. Stay sharp. The rain began again. Light, steady, and cold. It pattered softly against the windshield as Ethan started the engine and drove off. Behind him, the iron gate swayed in the wind, its hinges groaning like something ancient, remembering a promise. And upstairs, in the small, dim room, Lily pressed her forehead to the glass and whispered, Thank you, officer. Her words fogged the window briefly, fading before anyone could see. The next few days unfolded under a pale, reluctant sun. Maple Ridge wore its silence like a coat, too heavy to shake off, too familiar to complain about. The Hart House stood at the far end of Willow Lane, its shutters creaking softly with every breeze, as though whispering secrets to the trees. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and wine, and the faint hum of an old refrigerator that never quite shut properly. Sarah Hart spent her mornings pacing the kitchen, her phone clutched in one hand, her cigarette in the other. Her beauty, once the kind that turned heads at charity galas, was beginning to look worn. Cracked at the edges, like porcelain exposed to cold. The pale blue of her eyes had dulled to a steel gray that reflected no warmth. She had grown up being told that life was a ladder. You either climbed or got stepped on. That belief had carried her through failed marriages, unpaid debts, and now, through the loss of a man she never truly loved but depended on. Money, not affection, had always been her safety net, and the delay in the insurance payout was shredding that net strand by strand. Upstairs, Lily Hart sat at her small desk, pencil in hand. She was writing in a new notebook Ethan had quietly given her 2 days ago. He'd left it on the porch under the excuse of a lost police file, tucked neatly in a brown envelope. On the first page, Lily had written in uneven, looping letters, I will learn. I promised. Her handwriting was still shaky, but her determination was steady as heartbeat. Each letter she formed felt like a small rebellion against the silence her stepmother demanded. That morning, Sarah received another call from the insurance company. Her voice trembled with frustration as she spoke. You said everything was in order, Mr. Miles, she hissed, pacing back and forth. On the other end, Derek Miles, a lean 40-something insurance adjuster with thinning hair and a permanent sheen of nervous sweat, tried to sound reassuring. Paperwork takes time, Mrs. Hart. The system has to clear a secondary verification. You promised me last week, she snapped. Do I look like a woman who enjoys waiting? No, ma'am, he said quickly, wiping his forehead. I'll see what I can do. When she hung up, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine. Though it was barely past 10 in the morning, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window, the faint smudge of lipstick on the rim of the glass. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Don't let them see you sweat, girl. Winners never beg. The words steadied her, but only for a moment. Down the street, Officer Ethan Cole was sitting in his cruiser outside the elementary school. The morning light filtered through the windshield, catching the gold flecks in his tired eyes. Valor, sitting in the passenger seat, had his muzzle resting on the dashboard, nose twitching at the smell of wet grass and cafeteria food drifting from the open windows. Ethan had volunteered for school patrol that day, though the truth was he wanted to see if Lily had come to class. She hadn't. He frowned and made a note in his pocket journal, a habit he'd picked up after his wife's death. Writing things down made him feel in control, even when he wasn't. Absent again, he murmured. Valor lifted his head, as if listening. Yeah, Ethan sighed. I'm starting to think it's not just the flu. That evening, the town dipped into its usual quiet, the kind that made every sound sharper, the bark of a distant dog, the creak of a porch swing, the hum of a single passing car. Ethan sat on his couch with a mug of coffee gone cold. Valor stretched across the rug, eyes half open. On the television, the news anchor mentioned a brewing financial scandal, suspected insurance fraud across several counties. Ethan's phone buzzed. "Cole," he answered. "Ethan, it's Grace," came Deputy Grace Monroe's voice, low and brisk. "You've been keeping tabs on the Hart case, right?" He straightened slightly. "Off the record, yeah. Why?" "I just pulled banking data from a subpoena. The beneficiary on Samuel Hart's policy isn't clean. There's a secondary account in Florida under the name S.D. Harland. The signature on the transfer looks forged. Thought you'd want to know." Ethan rubbed his chin. "Sarah Hart. She probably thinks she's clever, changing one letter." Grace exhaled. "She's good. I'll give her that. But the paper trail's catching up. Just keep an eye on the girl, Ethan. If Sarah finds out she's being investigated, she might lash out." He looked down at Valor, who had now lifted his head, ears pricked. "Don't worry," Ethan said quietly. "We're already watching." That night, around 11, the rain began again, soft but persistent. The kind of rain that blurred the line between dreams and reality. Lily lay awake in bed, the dim light from the hallway spilling into her room. From downstairs came the faint sound of glass clinking and Sarah's muffled voice. She was talking to someone. Curious, Lily crept to the top of the stairs and peered through the railing. Sarah sat at the dining table, her phone on speaker. "I told you to move it quietly," she said in a harsh whisper. "If the police find out—" A man's voice replied faintly, distorted. "They won't, unless someone talks." Sarah's eyes darted toward the staircase, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Lily thought she'd been spotted. She pulled back quickly, heart hammering. Upstairs, the wind rattled her window. She thought about Officer Cole and Valor, about the signal he'd told her. 3 lights. Slowly, she reached for the lamp on her bedside table. 1 flash. 2. 3. Miles away, Ethan sat at his desk, going over reports. Valor stirred suddenly, ears snapping upright. The dog gave a sharp bark, then another. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" He glanced out the window toward the street, but the night looked calm. Still, his gut twisted. Valor had never barked without reason. Ethan grabbed his jacket. "All right, partner, let's go." When he arrived on Willow Lane, the rain had thickened into a curtain. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. Valor leapt from the SUV first, paws splashing into puddles. The gate creaked open under the dog's weight. From inside the house came a crash, a glass shattering, followed by a muffled cry. Ethan burst through the front door, weapon drawn. The living room was a mess, papers scattered, a wine bottle tipped over. Sarah stood by the stairs, face flushed with anger, a broken glass in her hand. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Where's Lily?" Ethan barked. "She's fine," Sarah shouted back, voice trembling. "You can't just barge into my home." Valor's growl cut her off. The dog stood at the foot of the stairs, fur bristling, gaze locked upward. Ethan followed it and saw Lily, huddled halfway up the steps, her lip bleeding. He holstered his gun and climbed toward her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." Sarah's voice wavered. "You can't take her. She's my daughter." Ethan turned to face her, his tone level but dangerous. "Not tonight, she's not." He guided Lily down, his hand steady on her shoulder. Valor moved beside them, eyes still fixed on Sarah, who stood trembling, her face pale under the hallway light. Outside, the storm howled, shaking the trees. Ethan placed Lily in the back seat of his cruiser and wrapped her in a blanket. "You did good, kiddo," he said gently. "You remembered." Valor climbed into the front, still alert. Sarah's voice echoed from the porch. "You'll regret this, officer." Ethan closed the door, the rain drumming on the roof like distant applause. "Maybe," he muttered, "but not as much as you will." As the cruiser pulled away, Lily glanced back at the house. Through the rain, she could barely make out the iron gate, swinging open and shut in the wind, like a promise breathing. The storm had not stopped by morning. It raged across Maple Ridge like a punishment, tearing branches from the old maple trees and washing the dust of the town into its gutters. By the time the first light broke through the gray, Ethan Cole was still awake. The heater in his small living room hummed quietly, while Lily Hart slept on the couch under a wool blanket, her face pale but calm. Valor, the German shepherd, lay curled on the rug beside her, eyes half open, guarding her like a silent sentinel. The only sound inside was the ticking of the wall clock and the steady breathing of the child who had just escaped a nightmare. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his uniform jacket draped over the back of a chair. His face, usually composed, looked drawn and haunted. A cup of coffee cooled untouched beside him. Every now and then he would glance toward Lily, as though checking to make sure she was still there, still safe. At dawn, the knock came. Sharp, urgent. Ethan rose immediately, Valor following him with a low growl. Standing at the door was Deputy Grace Monroe, her raincoat soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face. Her brown eyes were sharp and weary, but beneath that determination was concern. "I heard from dispatch," she said, stepping inside. "You took the girl?" Ethan nodded. "She signaled me. 3 lights, just like we talked about. I had no choice." Grace glanced at Lily sleeping on the couch. Her expression softened. "You did the right thing. But it's going to get messy, Ethan. I filed a preliminary report against Sarah Hart last night. The fraud case might give us leverage to keep Lily in protective custody, but only if we move fast." "Then we move," Ethan said firmly. Grace studied him for a moment. He was the kind of man whose sense of duty ran deep enough to break him if he wasn't careful. She'd seen it before, in soldiers, in officers who carried their grief like a second badge. "You'll need to testify, you know," she said quietly. Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, whatever it takes." By the time Lily woke, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. She looked disoriented for a moment, then noticed Valor's large brown eyes watching her. The dog's tail thumped once on the floor. "Hi," she whispered, touching his head. "You came back." Ethan crouched beside her. "You're safe here, Lily. Do you remember what happened last night?" She nodded slowly. She was shouting again. "About the money. I saw papers." She threw one into the fire. "What kind of papers?" Grace asked gently. "I think they had my dad's name on them." Grace and Ethan exchanged a look, a quiet, wordless agreement. That was enough for a search warrant. Outside, the storm had left behind a world washed raw. The streets glistened under the pale light. Sarah Hart's house stood dark and silent, but inside, anger was brewing like smoke. Sarah's hair was disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed. She had been drinking again, her lipstick smeared, her breath heavy with bitterness. The phone on the counter buzzed. It was Derek Miles, the insurance agent. "Sarah, listen," he said, his voice tight. "They're digging into the files. You've got to lay low. If they find out you used the Florida account, it's over for both of us." Sarah's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Lay low? You think I can just disappear? That cop took her, that little brat, and now everyone's going to think I'm the villain." "Sarah," Derek said urgently, "calm down. You'll make it worse." "Worse?" she hissed. "You don't know what worse is." She slammed the phone down, staring at her reflection in the window. The woman staring back at her looked older, meaner, someone she barely recognized. "You ruined me, Sam," she whispered to the ghost of her dead husband. "You and your damn kindness." Meanwhile, Ethan and Grace drove through town toward the courthouse. The cruiser's windshield wipers fought the lingering rain as they passed through streets where the world seemed unaware of the storm that had just shifted. In the back seat, Lily sat quietly, Valor's leash looped loosely around her wrist. She kept her eyes on the passing houses, the bakery with its fogged windows, the gas station where her father used to buy coffee. At the courthouse, Judge Eleanor Harland, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and the demeanor of someone who had seen too many tragedies, reviewed the emergency petition. Her gray eyes studied Ethan as he spoke. "The girl was in immediate danger, Your Honor. The marks on her arm and the statements she gave are consistent with neglect and physical abuse." Grace handed over the financial documents. "And the mother is under investigation for fraud involving her late husband's insurance policy. We're requesting temporary custody be granted to Officer Cole until Child Services can finalize placement. The judge looked over her glasses at Ethan. Officer, are you prepared to assume that responsibility? Yes, ma'am, Ethan said without hesitation. After a long silence, Judge Harland nodded. Then, consider it done. The child remains under Officer Cole's care until further review. She paused, her expression softening slightly. You've done right by her, son. Don't let the system break what's left of her trust. That afternoon, Ethan brought Lily to a small diner on Main Street, Marlene's, the kind of place where the smell of coffee never left the walls. Marlene Cooper, the owner, was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a laugh that came easily. She'd known Ethan since his early days on the force. Lord, Ethan, when was the last time you ate something that didn't come from a paper cup? She teased. He smiled faintly. Probably the last time you made me eat it. Marlene glanced at Lily and instantly softened. Well, aren't you a sweet thing? She said. Pancakes sound good? Lily nodded shyly. Valor sat obediently by the booth, his gaze following the waitress as she disappeared behind the counter. When the food came, Lily ate slowly, as if afraid the meal might vanish if she enjoyed it too much. You like dogs? Ethan asked. She smiled for the first time. He listens. People don't. Ethan's throat tightened. Yeah, he said softly. I know that feeling. Across town, Sarah was unraveling. She had stormed into the bank that afternoon, demanding answers from the clerk. When they told her the account was frozen pending investigation, she had thrown a folder across the counter. The clerk, a young man barely out of college, called security. By evening, word had spread through Maple Ridge. The widow Hart had lost her temper again. That night, as the sky cleared and stars finally returned, Ethan sat on his porch. Lily was inside reading a children's book out loud to Valor, who listened as though he understood every word. Grace called to confirm that Child Protective Services would review the case in 48 hours, but for now, Lily would stay under his guardianship. You did good today, Cole, Grace said, but don't let your guard down. She's cornered, and cornered people bite. Yeah, Ethan replied, watching the reflection of the stars ripple across the wet street. Let her try. Inside, Lily's voice drifted through the open window, soft and unsteady, but full of hope. And the brave knight kept his promise, she read, tracing each word carefully with her finger. Valor gave a small bark, tail wagging. Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only comes from exhaustion and peace colliding at once. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel empty. The sound of a child reading, halting, imperfect, but determined, filled the quiet spaces he thought would always belong to ghosts. As he stood to close the window, a faint rumble of thunder echoed over the mountains. The storm wasn't gone, not yet. But inside that little house at the edge of Maple Ridge, there was light, warmth, and the fragile beginnings of safety. The courthouse in Jefferson County stood like a gray monument against the morning sky. Rain had washed the stone clean overnight, leaving streaks of silver across its columns. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a place that had seen too many promises broken and too many truths buried under testimony. On that morning, the people of Maple Ridge filled the benches, drawn by the whispers of scandal, the widow Hart, the police officer, the child, and the money. Sarah Hart sat at the defendant's table, back straight, chin lifted high. She wore a black dress with a pearl collar and gloves that she kept adjusting, as if the act could steady her nerves. Her beauty, now brittle and sharp, drew glances from the gallery, but her eyes were hollow. She had not slept for days. Her lawyer, Edward Klein, was a man in his 50s with silver hair, expensive glasses, and the weary patience of someone who defended more guilty souls than innocent ones. He whispered occasionally to Sarah, who nodded but never looked at him. Across the room sat Ethan Cole, his uniform pressed, badge polished to a dull shine. He looked calm, but beneath that composure was a quiet storm. Lily Hart sat beside Deputy Grace Monroe, who had promised to stay with her through the hearing. Lily wore a soft blue dress Marlene from the diner had sewn for her, simple, with a ribbon around the waist. She held a small stuffed bear in her hands, its fur matted with age, its button eye replaced by a patch. Valor lay quietly at Ethan's feet, the tip of his tail flicking every so often. The dog's eyes never left the aisle where Sarah sat. When Judge Eleanor Harland entered, the room stood still. Her presence was firm, but not cruel. She carried herself like someone who had learned that justice wasn't always about punishment, but about balance. "Court is now in session," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "State of Vermont versus Sarah Hart. Charges, fraud, forgery, and child endangerment." The prosecutor, Daniel Foster, a tall man in his early 40s with an unshaven jaw and a reputation for precision, rose from his seat. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not merely a case of financial deceit. It's about betrayal, of a man's legacy, of a child's safety, and of the trust this community placed in one of its own." He turned towards Sarah. "The defendant exploited the death of her husband, forged financial documents, and abused the child left in her care. We will prove she did so deliberately and without remorse." Edward Klein countered smoothly, his tone calm and rehearsed. "Your Honor, my client is a grieving widow. She made mistakes, errors of judgment during a time of emotional distress. But fraud? Abuse? These are exaggerations made by an overzealous officer who overstepped his bounds." He gestured subtly toward Ethan. "Officer Cole may have acted out of misplaced heroism, but this case—" "That's enough, Mr. Klein," Judge Harlan interjected. "Stick to evidence, not theater." The first witness called was Derek Miles, the insurance adjuster. He looked uncomfortable in his cheap suit, his tie slightly crooked. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he raised his hand to swear the oath. Under the sharp glare of the prosecutor's questions, his resolve began to crumble. "Yes," he admitted finally, voice shaking. "I falsified the signatures. Mrs. Hart. She asked me to. She said she needed the money quickly, that it was what her husband would have wanted." Sarah's head snapped toward him. "You coward!" she hissed before her lawyer's hand restrained her. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's gaze hardened. Grace, standing behind Lily, leaned down and whispered, "See, the truth doesn't stay hidden forever." Lily nodded faintly, though her small hands clutched the bear tighter. Next came Ethan's testimony. He spoke simply, clearly, recounting the night of the storm, the signal lights, the bruises, the fear in the child's eyes. He didn't embellish or accuse, he just told it as it happened. When he mentioned Lily's promise to learn to read her father's letters, even the judge's expression softened. "Officer Cole," the defense lawyer asked on cross-examination, "you entered Mrs. Hart's home without a warrant, correct?" "I entered because I believed a child was in immediate danger," Ethan replied. "And that belief was based on what? A blinking porch light." Ethan didn't flinch. "Based on a child's cry for help, and I was right." A quiet stirred in the room. Grace met Ethan's eyes and nodded almost imperceptibly. The judge scribbled something on her pad. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The clerk called softly, "Lily Hart." The little girl stood, her dress swaying slightly. She walked to the witness stand, small shoes tapping nervously against the floor. The bailiff, a kind-eyed man with a gentle voice, helped her onto the chair. She looked around the courtroom, her gaze landing briefly on Ethan, then Valor, before settling on the judge. Judge Harlan leaned forward slightly. "You can take your time, sweetheart. Just tell the truth, that's all." Lily took a shaky breath. "She didn't like my notebook," she began quietly. "She said it was a waste. When I tried to keep it, she tore it up. Sometimes she didn't let me eat dinner." Her voice cracked, but she went on. "One night, she said Daddy's money wasn't enough. I didn't understand. Then I heard her talking to someone about burning papers. That's when I did the lights." Her words filled the room like a ripple across still water. Even Edward Klein didn't speak for several seconds. The judge's pen stopped moving. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Then, from somewhere, behind the defense table, came Sarah's voice, low, trembling, breaking. "I never meant to hurt her," she said suddenly. "You think it's easy, being left with nothing, with bills, with debt, with a child who looked at me and saw everything I wasn't?" Her words turned frantic, desperate. "You all think you're better than me. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." Her lawyer whispered harshly, "Sarah, stop!" But she stood up anyway, tears smudging her mascara. The judge's gavel struck once. Mrs. Hart, that's enough. Sarah sank back into her chair, shaking. The fight had drained out of her. By late afternoon, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: fraud, forgery, child endangerment. 7 years in prison, with parole review after 4. The sound of the gavel sealing the judgment felt like thunder, final and heavy. Lily looked at Ethan, unsure whether to smile or cry. He gave her a small nod. Valor pressed against her leg, warm and steady. As the bailiffs led Sarah away, she turned once, eyes meeting Ethan's. For a fleeting moment, her expression wasn't hatred, but something like regret. Then, it was gone. Outside the courthouse, the sky cleared. The last of the storm clouds drifted toward the mountains, leaving streaks of gold in their wake. Grace stepped out beside Ethan and Lily, holding her folder against her chest. "You did it," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "No, she did." He glanced at Lily, who was staring at the sunlight breaking through the clouds. Valor barked once, as if agreeing. In that fragile silence that follows victory, the town's noise slowly returned, the sound of cars, of laughter, of life moving forward. Ethan looked down at Lily, then at the horizon, and thought that maybe, just maybe, they had both found something close to peace. It had been 3 weeks since the verdict, and Maple Ridge had begun to breathe again. The snow on the hills had melted into thin streams that cut through the back roads like veins of silver, feeding the rivers and washing away what winter had left behind. The town was small but stubborn. People here whispered about tragedy one day and baked pies for you the next. At the edge of town stood Ethan Cole's house, an old craftsman cabin with cedar walls and a front porch wide enough for a rocking chair and a dog. On that morning, the air smelled of pine and rain. The flag outside rustled softly, and from the kitchen came the faint aroma of coffee. Lily Hart, now under Ethan's guardianship, sat at the dining table with a pencil in hand, tongue pressed to her lip, as she worked through a workbook Marlene had brought from the diner. She was learning to read faster now. The words that once scared her had become small steps, letters she could climb. Valor, Ethan's German shepherd, lay stretched across the doorway, his head resting on his paws. The dog was 7 years old, a mix of muscle and gentleness, with a scar on his right ear from a rescue mission years back. His eyes followed Lily constantly, not out of suspicion, but protectiveness, a habit he'd picked up from Ethan. Every time she turned a page, his tail thumped softly against the floor. Ethan entered, mug in hand. He had taken a few days off duty, something Grace had practically forced him to do. His dark blonde hair was slightly overgrown, his usual sharp uniform replaced by jeans and a gray flannel. He looked younger that way, almost human again after months of tension. "How's the homework?" he asked, leaning over her shoulder. Lily grinned shyly. "I finished the whole page." "Already?" He smiled, tapping the table lightly. "At this rate, you'll be teaching me soon." Before she could answer, a knock sounded at the door. Valor lifted his head, ears perked. Ethan opened it to find Grace Monroe, standing with a paper bag and her usual briskness. She was in her early 40s, tall, with sharp features softened by kindness she tried to hide. Her auburn hair was tied back, and her uniform still smelled faintly of rain and road dust. "You're feeding her cereal again, aren't you?" she said, walking past him and setting the bag down. "Here, pancakes from Marlene." Ethan smirked. "You know, you don't have to keep checking on us like we're a project." "Project?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "You're babysitting an 8-year-old and a traumatized dog, and you think I'm going to let that run unsupervised?" Lily giggled, hiding behind her pencil. Grace winked at her. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Between us, I think you're the more responsible one." For the rest of the morning, the little house was filled with sounds it hadn't known in years, plates clinking, laughter, the radio humming low. Outside, the world continued its rhythm. The birds returned, the mailman whistled, and the broken pieces of the past began, quietly, to realign. Around noon, a white van pulled up to the front yard. On its side were the words Maple Ridge Youth Outreach Program. Out stepped Evelyn Brooks, a social worker in her mid-30s. She was slender, with dark curls tied neatly at her neck, and glasses that always seemed to slide down her nose. Her voice carried the calm of someone who had spent years navigating pain with patience. "Officer Cole," she greeted warmly, "and this must be Lily." Lily nodded politely, though she half hid behind Valor, who regarded the newcomer with mild suspicion. Evelyn crouched slightly. "You must be Valor," she said, her tone playful. "I've heard all about you." The dog blinked, as if assessing whether she was trustworthy, then huffed softly, which Ethan took as approval. They sat down in the living room. "I just need to do a quick home check," Evelyn explained, opening her folder. "Standard procedure before we finalize guardianship paperwork. I promise. Nothing too intrusive." Ethan nodded, though he felt the weight of it. For a man who lived by procedure, being evaluated by one felt strangely personal. Evelyn moved through the house with quiet grace, checking the bedrooms, the pantry, the medicine cabinet. When she returned, she noticed Lily sitting by the window, notebook open, drawing. "What are you working on?" she asked gently. "It's Valor," Lily said, showing her a rough sketch. "He's guarding the gate." "That's beautiful," Evelyn said softly. "You know, dogs like Valor remember who they protect. He'll always stand by you." Lily nodded solemnly, as if that truth carried more weight than any law ever could. When Evelyn left, she handed Ethan a small envelope. "This is from the court. The foundation you helped start, the Turner Fund, they're considering a scholarship branch for children like Lily. They're naming it Project Haven." Ethan stared at her, taken aback. "I didn't even know it was in motion yet." "Well," she smiled, adjusting her glasses, "sometimes the good things move on their own." That evening, Ethan drove Lily to the community center, where a small ceremony was being held. Marlene had organized it with her usual unstoppable energy, filling the hall with baked pies, hot cocoa, and banners that read, "Welcome home, Lily." There were a dozen townsfolk, mechanics, teachers, bikers from the old Iron Brotherhood chapter, all gathered not out of obligation, but pride. When Lily stepped in, she froze. Applause broke out. Someone handed her a small book wrapped in ribbon. "It's your first library card," Marlene said, smiling through tears. "Now you can read as many stories as you want." Valor barked once, as if approving the gift. Ethan stood near the back, hands in his pockets, watching her. Laugh, a real laugh, full and unguarded. Grace appeared beside him, sipping coffee. "You look like a proud father," she teased. He chuckled softly. "Maybe I am." "Then act like one," she said, nudging his shoulder. "She needs more than protection now. She needs roots." Ethan turned thoughtful. The word roots lingered in his mind like a seed waiting for soil. Later that night, as they returned home, the stars burned bright above the ridge. Lily leaned against the window, half asleep, Valor's head resting on her knee. Ethan drove in silence, the hum of the engine steady and calm. When they pulled into the driveway, he saw something on the porch, an envelope tucked under the doormat. He picked it up, frowning. Inside was a short letter in neat handwriting. "Officer Cole, thank you for what you've done. Some debts can't be repaid, but they can be honored. The Iron Brotherhood is donating to Project Haven in memory of Jack Turner. Keep your promise alive. Mason Reed." Ethan smiled faintly, feeling that old warmth in his chest, the same feeling Jack once inspired in everyone who crossed his path. When he stepped inside, Lily had already curled up on the couch, her new library card clutched in her small hand. Valor circled twice and lay beside her, eyes half shut but alert. Ethan dimmed the lights and stood in the doorway for a long moment. He thought of all the things this house had seen: grief, anger, silence, and now, laughter. The world outside was still uncertain, but within these walls, something had begun again. Not just for Lily, but for him. He whispered softly to himself, "We're home now," and Valor's tail thumped twice in reply. The first true spring morning arrived quietly over Maple Ridge. Mist hung low above the valley, curling through the pine trees like silk ribbons. From the porch of Ethan Cole's house, one could hear the distant hum of the river thawing, the steady rhythm of a world learning to breathe again after a long season of storms. Inside, sunlight poured through the windows and painted everything in gold: the wooden floor, the worn armchair, and the small desk by the window where Lily Hart now spent most of her mornings. Lily had grown. She was still small for her age, but her posture had changed. There was confidence in the way she held her pencil, a quiet pride in every line she wrote. On the desk lay her latest creation, a handwritten story titled "The Dog Who Saved the Wind." Her handwriting was still uneven, but each letter carried a kind of determination that spoke louder than perfection ever could. Beside her, Valor slept with his head resting near her feet, his ears twitching whenever she whispered words aloud to test their sound. Ethan stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee. He'd taken to wearing an old flannel jacket even when it wasn't cold. It had belonged to his father, a man he rarely spoke about. That morning, as he glanced at Lily's small silhouette against the light, something in him softened. He realized that the silence that once filled this house had transformed. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. Grace Monroe stopped by around mid-morning, as she often did now. She was in civilian clothes for once, a navy cardigan over jeans, her auburn hair loose and curling slightly in the humidity. In her hands she carried 2 envelopes and a small potted plant wrapped in brown paper. "Morning, Cole," she greeted, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. "I brought official paperwork and unofficial caffeine." Ethan smiled faintly. "You're getting predictable, Monroe." "I'll take that as a compliment." She placed the plant on the counter. "From Marlene. She says the house needs more green. Said it'll soak up the sadness in the corners." Her words, not mine. Lily looked up from her writing. "Can I plant it outside?" Grace smiled. "That's the idea, but only if you promise not to name it Pancake like you did with the last one." Lily giggled, cheeks pink. "That was Valor's idea." Valor gave a low grunt from his corner, tail swishing lazily, as if conceding guilt. Grace turned serious then, sliding the first envelope across the counter. "This is from Child Services. It's official. Your guardianship's permanent, Ethan. She's yours, legally." Ethan's hand hesitated before he picked it up. The paper felt heavy, not from weight, but meaning. He looked toward Lily, who had gone still, waiting for him to say something. "So that means," she asked softly. "It means you're home," Ethan said simply. Grace's second envelope was addressed to Lily. "This one's for you, kiddo. Project Haven picked your story for their first newsletter. They even printed it." Lily gasped. "Really?" Grace nodded, grinning. "You're a published author now." Lily threw her arms around Valor's neck, burying her face in his fur, while the dog wagged his tail with such force that one of Ethan's boots nearly tipped over. Later that day, they drove into town for the Project Haven open house. The community center had been freshly painted, with murals of forests, rivers, and, of course, dogs. Children ran in the yard, their laughter rising like birdsong. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet hope. Posters lined the walls, displaying stories of resilience and small acts of kindness that had blossomed into something larger. At the center of it all was Mason Reed, the old biker who had once ridden with Jack Turner. Mason was tall and broad-shouldered, his gray beard now streaked with white. He wore a leather vest patched with the Iron Brotherhood insignia and a faded t-shirt that read, "Never Ride Alone." He was setting up an engine display for the mechanical training program when Ethan and Lily arrived. "Look what the wind blew in," Mason said, his gravelly voice warm. "You ready for your speech, Officer Cole?" Ethan frowned. "Speech?" Grace, standing beside him, crossed her arms. "You didn't read the program, did you?" "I thought that was just," Ethan began, but Mason interrupted with a grin. "Relax, it's just a few words. Tell folks why we're doing this. You know, give them hope. You're good at that." Ethan sighed, glancing at Lily. "I don't know about good." "You will be," Mason said. "You've got the look of a man who kept his word. That's rarer than gold these days." When it came time for the event to begin, the crowd gathered under a string of yellow lights. Marlene served pie, Grace handled the logistics, and Mason stood near the back, arms folded. Ethan stepped up to the small stage, holding Lily's hand, as Valor sat obediently at his feet. He cleared his throat, looking at the faces before him, neighbors, officers, children, strangers who'd come to see what redemption looked like. "I don't have a lot of speeches in me," he began, "but I know what it's like to lose your way. And I know what it's like when someone reaches out, even when you think you're not worth saving. This place, this project, it's about that reach. It's about giving a hand to someone still stuck in the dark. He paused, glancing down at Lily. A long time ago, a man I respected told me that keeping a promise could change a life. He was right. It changed mine. The applause was gentle at first, then grew, steady and heartfelt. Lily blushed under the lights, clutching Valor's leash. Grace clapped the loudest, while Mason gave a small nod, pride softening his usually stoic features. As dusk fell, the townsfolk gathered outside. Children played tag near the riverbank. Lily and a few other kids planted flowers in the new community garden. Marlene took photos, laughing. Mason taught a teenager how to check spark plugs on an old motorcycle. The air was alive with the sound of voices, laughter, the hum of something beautiful being rebuilt from ruin. Ethan sat on the steps with Grace, watching the sunset paint the mountains in rose and amber. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Grace asked, her tone casual but curious. "Once," he admitted. "Now, not so much." "Good," she said softly. "The world needs more people who stay." Valor wandered over, pressing his head against Ethan's leg. Lily ran up a moment later, dirt smudged on her cheek and a bright smile across her face. "Dad," she said breathlessly, "can I show you the flowers I planted?" The word hit him like sunlight breaking through clouds. Dad. He blinked, caught off guard, then smiled and nodded. "Lead the way." As they walked toward the garden, the twilight deepened, wrapping Maple Ridge in shades of lavender and blue. The town that had once been haunted by tragedy now felt alive again, its heart beating steady. For Ethan, the sound of Lily's laughter and Valor's paws against the grass was enough to know. Some promises don't just save others, they save the ones who make them. Summer settled over Maple Ridge like a deep, gentle sigh. The mountains shimmered in the heat haze, their ridges soft against the blue sky. Wildflowers filled the fields, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted through open windows. Life had found its rhythm again, slow, honest, healing. The world that had once been fractured now carried the faint sound of laughter, of hammers from the community center, of a child's voice reading out loud on the porch. It had been nearly a year since the founding of Project Haven. The program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a single outreach in the heart of a small Vermont town had become a network of volunteers, teachers, and former officers working to protect and educate children across the county. At its center was Lily Hart, now 9 years old, her hair longer, her face fuller, and her eyes bright with the confidence that comes from being loved. She still read aloud every morning, her words stronger, her voice surer. Beside her, Valor, now grayer around the muzzle, still watched faithfully, ears twitching at every turn of the page. Ethan Cole stood in the yard, sleeves rolled up, fixing the fence with Mason Reed. The older biker looked nearly the same, broad-shouldered, gruff, but his beard had turned fully white, and there was a slowness to his movements now. He still wore his leather vest, the Iron Brotherhood patch faded to near invisibility. "You ever gonna let that kid mow the lawn?" Mason asked, squinting against the sun. Ethan chuckled. "She offered last week." "And you said no?" "She's 9, Mason." Mason wiped sweat from his brow. "So was I when I rebuilt my first bike carburetor. You don't learn by staying clean." Ethan smiled. Mason was right, of course. He'd been right about many things. "You still thinking about retiring?" Ethan asked. "Retiring from what? Drinking bad coffee and scaring teenagers?" Mason snorted. "Not a chance. Someone's got to keep the shop running while you're out playing family man." Their laughter carried across the yard. It was the kind of sound that made the place feel alive again. That afternoon, Grace Monroe stopped by, as she often did, though these days without paperwork. She had traded her uniform for a light sundress, something rare for her, and her hair was down, catching the sunlight. "Don't look so surprised," she said when Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I own clothes that aren't navy blue, you know." "Could have fooled me," Mason muttered, pretending to focus on the fence. Grace smirked. "You missed a spot, old man." Lily came running from the porch, waving a paper in her hand. "Dad, Ms. Grace, look." She held out a crayon drawing, 3 figures standing under a big oak tree, 1 tall man, 1 smaller girl, and a big dog beside them. Above it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "My family." Ethan crouched beside her, his throat tightening. That's beautiful, kiddo. Grace smiled softly. You even got Valor's ears right. Lily giggled, looking proud. I'm giving it to Mason to hang in the shop. Mason blinked, caught off guard. You sure you want that old place to have the honor? Uh-huh, Lily said seriously. It's where people fix things. The silence that followed was gentle and full. By late afternoon, the town gathered at Turner's garage for the one-year anniversary of Project Haven. The building had changed, its walls freshly painted cream and blue, the old garage sign restored with a brass plate that read, "A place where promises keep growing." Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a small stage adorned with wildflowers. Photos of smiling children lined the walls, students, volunteers, and families whose lives had been touched by the project. Ethan was to give another speech, though he hated speeches. Grace teased him about it all morning. You're getting good at pretending you hate it, she said as they walked in. Marlene Cooper, now something of a town legend, had taken charge of catering. She bustled around in a bright apron, her cheeks flushed and her voice cheerful. Sit, eat, talk later. I made extra pie for the officer's little one. Thanks, Marlene, Ethan said, as Lily beamed and reached for a plate. On stage, Mason adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. Before we start, he said, I just want to say this. None of this would exist if a stubborn cop hadn't kept a promise. Ethan, you're up. Ethan stepped forward to quiet applause. His gaze swept across the room, faces he knew, faces he didn't, all connected by something unseen but deeply felt. When this all began, he started, none of us were looking for glory. We were just trying to make things right for one little girl. But somewhere along the way, that one promise became something larger. It became a reason for hope. He paused, glancing at Lily in the front row, Valor's head resting against her knee. Sometimes life gives us second chances, not to fix the past, but to build something better from it. And if you're lucky, you get to do it surrounded by people who believe in the same kind of good. When the applause ended, Mason handed him a small box. From the Brotherhood, he said. Something we made for you. Inside was a handcrafted badge carved from steel and wood. It bore the emblem of the Iron Brotherhood intertwined with a police shield. On the back was engraved, Promises Kept. Ethan smiled, his voice low. Tell them thank you. You just did, Mason replied, nodding toward the door. Outside, a group of bikers stood lined up beside their motorcycles, engines idling like a heartbeat. They gave a small salute before roaring off down the road, the echo of their engines rolling across the hills. As dusk fell, the town lights flickered on. Children chased fireflies across the yard. Marlene danced clumsily with one of the teachers. Grace sat beside Ethan on the steps, her eyes soft. You did it, she said quietly. He shook his head. We did it. Lily appeared a moment later, carrying Valor's leash. Can we go for a walk, Dad? Just us and Valor? Ethan glanced at Grace, who nodded. Go ahead, the world's still got room for good walks. They strolled down the gravel road, the sky painted in streaks of violet and orange. Lily held his hand while Valor trotted ahead, stopping every few steps to sniff the air. The river reflected the last light of day, and the breeze carried the faint hum of cicadas. Dad? Lily said softly. Do you think Mom will ever be happy again? Ethan hesitated. He thought of Sarah, angry, broken, now serving her sentence far away. I think maybe she will, he said at last. Sometimes people need to lose everything before they understand what matters. Lily nodded slowly, as if she understood more than her age allowed. I hope she does. When they reached the old bridge, they stopped. Below them, the water shimmered like molten glass. Ethan lifted her up so she could see better. Look at that, he murmured. See how the light always finds its way through? She smiled. Just like us. He pressed a kiss to her hair. Just like us. Valor barked once, his reflection rippling across the water. They stayed there until the stars began to appear, quiet, steady witnesses to the end of a long, hard journey. And as they turned back toward home, the porch light of the little cabin flickered on, casting its warm glow through the night. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a promise fulfilled, a promise that love, once found, could outlast even the darkest storms. In the quiet town of Maple Ridge, we witnessed how one small act of compassion can become the echo of a miracle. When Officer Ethan opened his door to a frightened child, he didn't just rescue her. He reminded us that God's love often works through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Just like Ethan, we are all called to be the answer to someone's prayer, to bring light where fear once lived. In our daily lives, kindness is never wasted. It is the language through which God still speaks. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you believe that God still works miracles in quiet ways, write Amen below. May the Lord bless you, protect your family, and fill your heart with peace. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in our darkest nights, His light never fades.